Picture this: a world where a single handwritten book could buy you a castle, where kings and queens schemed not just for crowns, but for pages filled with ancient wisdom. In the shadows of medieval Europe's grandest battles, another war raged, one fought in silent scriptoriums and vaulted libraries, where the true currency wasn't gold, but knowledge. This was an era when owning a rare manuscript could tilt the balance of power, and monarchs would stop at nothing to amass the greatest treasure of all: books. You might think of medieval rulers as conquerors of land, but their most cunning campaigns were often waged over parchment. Imagine a king sending spies to steal a rival's prized Aristotle translation, or a queen trading prisoners for a crumbling copy of Ptolemy's star charts. These weren't just acts of curiosity, they were calculated moves in a high-stakes game where control of knowledge meant control of empires. Libraries became fortresses, scribes turned into soldiers, and the written word was the ultimate weapon. So why did these rulers risk so much for books? Because in a time when few could read, those who held the texts held the keys to law, science, and even the divine. A well-stocked library could legitimize a dynasty, outshine a rival's court, or unlock military strategies buried in ancient scrolls. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on history's most extraordinary book heists, secret alliances forged over manuscripts, and the monarchs who knew that the pen, or rather, the quill, was truly mightier than the sword. This is the untold story of the unseen war that shaped the medieval world, one page at a time. To understand why medieval monarchs fought so fiercely for books, we have to step into their world, a place where a single manuscript could take a scribe years to complete. Picture a monk hunched over his desk, painstakingly copying each letter by candlelight, mixing precious inks from crushed minerals, and even weaving threads of real gold into the pages. This wasn't just writing, it was an act of devotion and craftsmanship. The result, a book so valuable it could be traded for a small fortune, or even a tract of land. But the true power of these books went far beyond their material worth. In an age where most people couldn't read, controlling knowledge meant controlling the very fabric of society. Think of a king like Charlemagne, who surrounded himself with scholars to compile legal codes and religious texts, using them to unify his sprawling empire. Or Alfonso X of Castile, who commissioned translations of Arabic scientific works, turning his court into a beacon of learning that outshone his rivals. These rulers weren't just collecting books, they were building intellectual arsenals, and the competition was fierce. When the Byzantine Empire fell in the 15th century, its priceless Greek manuscripts became the ultimate prize. Italian princes and scholars raced to salvage them, knowing these ancient texts could spark a cultural revolution. Meanwhile, monasteries hid their rarest volumes behind locked doors, fearing raids from rival lords or even fellow clerics. Because in this high-stakes game, a single stolen manuscript could tip the balance of power, rewriting history in ink before the first sword was even drawn. Long before grand royal libraries dotted the landscape of Europe, there were places where knowledge survived against all odds, the quiet cloisters of monasteries. Here in candlelit scriptoriums, generations of monks dedicated their lives to preserving the written word, copying every line by hand on delicate vellum. Their work was slow, meticulous, sometimes spanning decades for a single volume. But these weren't just books, they were time capsules safeguarding the ideas of Aristotle, the medical wisdom of Galen, and the sacred texts that shaped civilizations. Monastic libraries became fortresses of knowledge in an unstable world. While wars raged outside within those thick stone walls, manuscripts survived plagues, invasions, and the collapse of empires. The monks didn't just copy texts, they annotated them, debated their meanings, and sometimes even smuggled forbidden works to safety. A Benedictine abbey in Monte Cassino or a Carolingian monastery like St. Gall didn't just store books. They functioned as living universities centuries before the first formal scholars' guilds. But such treasure couldn't stay hidden forever. Kings soon realized that these monasteries held something more valuable than relics or gold. They held the keys to governance, medicine, and even military strategy. Charlemagne, that towering figure of the early Middle Ages, didn't just conquer lands, he conquered knowledge. He ordered monasteries to standardize their scripts, making books easier to read across his empire. He funded scriptoriums and even recruited scholars from distant lands to translate and compile texts. His vision, a kingdom where wisdom served the crown. Not all rulers were so benevolent. Some saw monasteries as vaults to be plundered. When Viking raids struck coastal abbeys, they didn't just take silver, they ripped apart illuminated gospels for their jeweled covers, burning the pages as kindling. Even fellow Christians weren't above theft. Rival lords would borrow manuscripts under the guise of piety, only to never return them. And when a powerful abbot died, his library often became a battleground, with bishops and nobles alike jockeying to claim the most prized codices. The tension between sacred and secular control simmered for centuries. A king might protect a monastery, only to later demand its books as repayment for patronage. A wealthy noble could endow a scriptorium, then use its output to sway papal politics. Even the church itself wrestled with the dilemma: should knowledge be hoarded for the devout or shared to strengthen kingdoms? In the shadows of this struggle, one truth became clear: whether through piety or power, whoever controlled the books controlled the future. And as the medieval world grew hungrier for knowledge, that battle would only intensify. Charlemagne didn't just wear a crown, he carried a quill. At a time when most rulers measured their strength in armies and land, this Frankish king saw something deeper. An empire built on parchment could outlast one built on swords. His court at Aachen became a whirlwind of intellectual activity, where scholars from Ireland to Italy gathered to translate, debate, and copy texts with almost military precision. But this wasn't just about prestige. Every manuscript produced in his royal scriptoria served a strategic purpose, standardizing religious liturgy to unite distant provinces, preserving Roman legal codes to strengthen his governance, even compiling medical texts to keep his armies healthy. The scale of his ambition was staggering. Charlemagne's scribes developed a new, cleaner script, Carolingian minuscule, that made books easier to read across linguistic borders. He ordered every monastery and cathedral in his realm to establish schools, creating the first Europe-wide education system since Rome's fall. And when he couldn't find enough local talent, he lured scholars like the Anglo-Saxon Alcuin with promises of patronage, turning his court into a melting pot of Christian, Jewish, and even Arabic knowledge. But such brilliance cast a dangerous shadow. Rival kings watched with growing unease as Charlemagne's library swelled. To them, these weren't just books, they were blueprints for empire. A Visigothic ruler might lose sleep over Frankish copies of Isidore of Seville's encyclopedias, knowing they contained maps and tactics. The Byzantine emperor, whose Greek classics were Europe's most coveted treasures, guarded his manuscripts like state secrets. Even the papacy hesitated after all. A king who controlled biblical interpretation could challenge Rome itself. Charlemagne's greatest insight: that conquests fade, but ideas endure. When Viking raids later shattered his descendants' kingdoms, It was the monasteries he'd fortified with knowledge that kept civilization alive. His scriptoria became arks, preserving everything from Virgil's poetry to agricultural manuals that would feed generations. And though his political empire fractured, his intellectual one grew stronger, laying the groundwork for everything from medieval universities to the Renaissance. The lesson was clear. In the unseen war for books, the real victors weren't those who hoarded knowledge, but those who let it flow like a river, nourishing the future. While Europe's monasteries guarded their precious manuscripts like dragon hoards, an intellectual revolution was unfolding a world away. In the bustling heart of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom stood as a beacon of learning, its shelves groaning under the weight of thousands of volumes: Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, all meticulously translated into Arabic. This wasn't just a library, it was a factory of ideas where scholars of every faith worked side by side to push the boundaries of knowledge. And it would soon become the unlikely spark that reignited Europe's thirst for books. The contrast couldn't have been starker. At a time when even Charlemagne's grandest libraries held a few hundred volumes, the House of Wisdom boasted tens of thousands. While European scribes still debated whether the earth was flat, Islamic astronomers were calculating its circumference with stunning accuracy. Their medical texts, filled with detailed anatomical illustrations and surgical techniques, made Europe's herb-laden remedies look primitive. But it wasn't just about superiority, it was about accessibility. Where Christian monasteries often locked away knowledge, Islamic libraries welcomed scholars from across the known world, creating a crossroads of ideas that would reshape history. Then came the Crusades, not just a clash of swords but of books. European knights returning from the Holy Land brought back unexpected trophies, Arabic manuscripts stuffed in their saddlebags, sometimes torn from libraries they'd raided. At first, these texts were curiosities, until shrewd rulers like Alfonso X of Castile realized their worth. He assembled teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars in Toledo, turning the city into a translation powerhouse. Aristotle's lost works, preserved in Arabic, Ptolemy's star charts annotated by Baghdad's astronomers, these weren't just scholarly treasures, they were strategic weapons. The race to translate became a quiet arms race. In Sicily, Emperor Frederick Roman II himself, fluent in Arabic, sent agents to scour markets from Cairo to Damascus for scientific treatises. Venetian merchants, spotting an opportunity, began trafficking in manuscripts as eagerly as spices or silk. Even the Pope took notice, commissioning Latin versions of Arabic medical texts to train European physicians. But with every translation came a dilemma: how much of this foreign knowledge could be trusted? Some clerics burned Arabic books as heresy, while forward-thinking monarchs secretly funded their translation, knowing that mastering algebra or optics could give their kingdoms an edge. Perhaps the greatest irony of this knowledge war was its unintended consequence. As Europe devoured Arabic texts, they rediscovered their own forgotten heritage: Aristotle's logic, Euclid's geometry, all preserved by Islamic scholars when Europe had let them fade. The very books that once fueled Baghdad's golden age would now power the Renaissance, turning the tide in a war where the real victor wasn't any king or caliph, but knowledge itself. And the next battlefield, the fledgling universities of Europe, where these translated ideas would ignite debates that still shape our world today. In the dimly lit chambers of Toledo's scriptoriums, a different kind of siege was underway, one fought with dictionaries and ink wells. Here, under the watchful eye of King Alfonso X, teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars pored over crumbling Arabic manuscripts, racing to unlock their secrets. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it was a high-stakes game of intellectual espionage. Every translated page could reveal military tactics from Sun Tzu, medical cures from Avicenna, or star charts that might guide a navy to victory. Alfonso didn't just want a library, he wanted an arsenal of ideas. The work was painstaking. A single mistranslated word could turn a recipe for medicine into poison, or a siege strategy into a death trap. Scholars debated every term, cross-referencing Greek, Hebrew, and Latin versions of the same text. Some manuscripts had passed through so many hands, from Athens to Alexandria, Baghdad to Byzantium, that their original meanings were buried under layers of scribble errors. Yet the rewards were worth the risk. When Alfonso's teams finished translating Ptolemy's Almagest, they didn't just gain an astronomy manual, they acquired a celestial roadmap that could predict eclipses, a terrifying advantage for a superstitious enemy army. But Toledo was hardly the only battleground. In Sicily, Emperor Frederick Roman II, a ruler so fascinated by Arabic science that he kept a menagerie of exotic animals to test ancient zoological theories, established his own translation corps. His prize acquisition, a lost treatise on falconry that became the medieval equivalent of a drone warfare manual, revolutionizing hunting and battlefield reconnaissance. Meanwhile, in Montpellier, medical schools hoarded Arabic texts on surgery, guarding them like state secrets. A single translated diagram of a human vein could mean the difference between life and death for a wounded knight or a king. The irony, many of these Arabic texts were actually Greek classics, preserved by Islamic scholars while Europe had forgotten them. When Alfonso's teams translated Aristotle's works back into Latin, they were unwittingly reclaiming their own heritage. Yet the political stakes kept rising. Popes condemned some translations as heresy, while kings quietly funded others, creating a shadow market for forbidden knowledge. A well-placed translator could become more valuable than a spy. After all, stealing a single manuscript was useless if no one could read it. By the 13th century, the scramble for translated knowledge had reshaped Europe's power map. Universities in Paris and Bologna swelled with students hungry for these rediscovered texts, while royal courts employed book scouts to track down rare manuscripts. The message was clear. In the New World Order, the true conquerors wouldn't be those with the largest armies, but those who commanded the most potent weapon of all, the translated word. And as the Renaissance dawned, this underground river of ideas would burst its banks, flooding Europe with the knowledge that would remake the world. The sack of Constantinople in the year 1204 wasn't just a military disaster. It was history's greatest library heist. As Crusader armies poured into the Byzantine capital, they didn't just seize gold or silks. They ransacked scriptoriums, tearing illuminated gospels from their jeweled covers and stuffing chests with manuscripts like common plunder. For these knights, a parchment detailing Aristotle's logic might have seemed less valuable than a goblet, until shrewd commanders realized they'd stumbled upon a different kind of treasure. Ships bound for Venice and Genoa soon groaned under the weight of stolen codices, their contents destined to fuel the Italian Renaissance centuries later. But grand conquests were only half the story. Some of history's most audacious book thefts happened in shadows and secrecy. Take Matilda of Tuscany, the 11th century noblewoman who borrowed a prized copy of Justinian's legal codes from a monastery and simply never returned it. Or the Duke of Burgundy, who disguised his agents as pilgrims to infiltrate rival libraries, smuggling out manuscripts hidden in hollowed-out loaves of bread. Even royal marriages became Trojan horses for book smuggling. When the Byzantine Princess Theodora married the German King Conrad III, her dowry included a volume so rare it was said to contain the lost military strategies of Alexander the Great, a gift more strategic than any chest of jewels. The most brazen thefts often targeted sacred texts. Viking raiders who once burned manuscripts for kindling gradually learned their true worth. By the 12th century, Norse kings were demanding illuminated Bibles as tribute, their once indifferent warriors now carefully wrapping parchment in oiled cloth before sailing home. Meanwhile, in Spain, the fall of Muslim Granada saw Christian knights hauling away entire Arabic libraries, only for scholars to later discover those same texts held advanced mathematics that would revolutionize European engineering. What's striking isn't just the scale of these thefts, but their lasting consequences. A manuscript looted from Constantinople might resurface generations later in Florence, sparking a philosophical revolution. A medical text stolen during a border skirmish could save thousands from plague. These weren't just acts of greed. They were desperate bids to claim the one advantage no army could replicate: the accumulated wisdom of centuries, captured not by force of arms but by cunning and opportunism. And as the medieval world grew more connected, the race to control these stolen ideas would only grow fiercer, rewriting the rules of power itself. Behind the Vatican's towering walls lay a library unlike any other, a fortress of parchment where access to a single manuscript could make or break a king's ambitions. This wasn't just a collection of books, it was the nerve center of medieval Europe's spiritual and political landscape. Popes understood the power they held in those vaulted halls. A strategically lost text could discredit a rival monarch, while a carefully shared translation might secure an alliance. When Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II dared to question papal authority, the Vatican scholars unearthed ancient canons to prove his coronation invalid, a masterstroke of archival warfare. The competition to influence this knowledge stronghold took bizarre turns. French kings donated lavish illuminated Bibles, their gold leaf borders hiding subtle propaganda, depictions of French saints placed prominently beside the apostles. The Visconti family of Milan smuggled in heretical texts disguised as prayer books, hoping to sway doctrinal debates. Even Byzantine emperors, desperate for Western aid against Ottoman advances, sent priceless Greek codices as bargaining chips. But the Vatican's librarians were no naive custodians. They catalogued every donation with suspicion, often locking away dangerous volumes in the infamous secret archives, where only the Pope's inner circle could tread. Perhaps the most cunning players in this game were the Vatican's own scribes. These scholars wielded quiet influence, deciding which classical texts deserved preservation and which should fade into obscurity. A well-placed footnote could elevate a favored philosopher or erase a controversial theologian from history. When humanist scholars like Poggio Bracciolini begged access to the library, they weren't just seeking knowledge, they were mining for intellectual gold, knowing a rediscovered Cicero or Lucretius could shake Europe's universities to their foundations. The true testament to the Vatican's power, its unmatched ability to silence as well as speak. For every text displayed to dazzle visiting dignitaries, another was deliberately withheld. Kings would leave Rome empty-handed after begging for medical treatises or military engineering manuals, only to later discover the Vatican had quietly shared those very texts with their rivals. This delicate dance of revelation and concealment turned the library into a chessboard where the stakes weren't territory, but truth itself, and for nearly 1,000 years, the Vatican remained the grandmaster of the game. Frederick II wasn't just a Holy Roman Emperor, he was history's most rebellious librarian. While other rulers obeyed the Church's list of forbidden texts, Frederick turned his Sicilian court into a sanctuary for banned knowledge, collecting everything from Arabic treatises on anatomy to Jewish Kabbalistic scrolls. His agents scoured the Mediterranean like intellectual pirates, bribing, bartering, or outright stealing manuscripts that would have sent lesser men to the stake. But this wasn't mere rebellion. Frederick understood something terrifying to his enemies. The right book in the right hands could dismantle centuries of dogma overnight. Take his infamous experiment with language. Suspecting that speech was learned, not innate, he ordered foster mothers to raise infants in silence, no lullabies, no words, just to see if they'd spontaneously speak Hebrew, Latin, or Arabic. The results were disastrous. The children died without human interaction, but the mere fact that he dared test such ideas sent shockwaves through Europe. Clerics whispered that his library contained the lost books of Solomon, while rival kings panicked over rumors that his Arabic military manuals included Greek fire recipes. Even his passion for falconry turned subversive. His lavishly illustrated book on the subject didn't just detail hunting techniques. It quietly challenged church doctrine by suggesting animals had reasoning powers akin to humans. The backlash was swift. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated Frederick not once but twice, accusing him of heresy for consorting with infidel texts. In reality, the Vatican feared something far worse than sacrilege. They feared obsolescence. Frederick's translations of Aristotle's works on logic, suppressed for centuries by the Church, were now being debated in public squares. His copies of Arab astronomer Alhazen's optics treatises disproved biblical descriptions of vision, and his court mathematicians, using stolen Arabic numerals, were calculating taxes with an efficiency that made feudal lords tremble. Yet Frederick's greatest crime wasn't owning forbidden books, it was sharing them. He established the University of Naples in 1224, not as a cloistered seminary, but as a secular knowledge factory where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars dissected texts side by side. For the first time since antiquity, a ruler had weaponized education itself, creating a generation of bureaucrats and lawyers trained to question, not obey. By the time Frederick died in 1250, his enemies had burned much of his library, but the damage was done. The seeds he planted would sprout into the Renaissance, proving that even ashes couldn't extinguish the ideas he'd smuggled into Europe's imagination. In the candlelit cellars of medieval Europe, far from the grand libraries and royal courts, a different kind of scribe bent over his work, not for God or king, but for the highest bidder. These clandestine copyists operated in the shadows, their quills scratching out forbidden texts by night, their workshops hidden behind butcher shops or wine cellars to avoid detection. A wealthy merchant might commission a stolen copy of Aristotle's lost works. A rival duke could pay to duplicate a military manual from his enemy's collection, and even bishops secretly ordered heretical texts, their covers disguised as prayer books. This was the black market of manuscripts, where knowledge wasn't just power, it was profit. The trade had its own rules and risks. A scribe caught copying a rare manuscript without permission could lose his hands or worse. Yet the rewards were too tempting to resist. In Venice, a skilled forger could earn 10 times a year's wages by replicating a single illuminated gospel, aging the parchment with tea stains and rubbing the ink with ashes to mimic centuries of wear. Some counterfeiters grew so adept that even experts were fooled, like the infamous case of a French nobleman who paid a fortune for what he believed was Charlemagne's personal Bible, only to discover the ancient script was a clever imitation, the gold leaf actually brass powder mixed with egg yolk. Kings played both sides of this underground market. They publicly condemned book thieves while secretly employing their own agents to acquire texts by any means necessary. English spies infiltrated Parisian monasteries to sketch floor plans of library vaults. Spanish diplomats smuggled Arabic medical treatises out of Granada in hollowed-out diplomatic pouches. Even the Church participated. Vatican librarians were known to lose controversial texts, only for perfect copies to reappear in the hands of wealthy patrons months later. But the most audacious players were the book hunters, professional thieves who specialized in manuscript theft. Some posed as pilgrims, hiding stolen pages in their staffs. Others bribed librarians with wine, waiting until they passed out to raid the shelves. The boldest operated in plain sight, like the Italian scholar who borrowed a priceless Cicero manuscript from a monastery, promising to return it after study, then fled across borders with his prize. These heists weren't just about wealth, they were acts of cultural sabotage. When the Duke of Burgundy's agents stole a Flanders battle chronicle from a rival court, they didn't just take the book, they burned the original, ensuring their duke's version of history would be the only one that survived. The black market's legacy was double-edged. While it spread knowledge to unexpected corners of Europe, it also corrupted it. Mistranslations multiplied as texts passed through unqualified hands. Forgeries muddled scholarly debates for generations. Yet without this shadow trade, many ancient works might have vanished entirely. Their survival owed not to kings or monks, but to the greed, cunning, and sheer audacity of those who traded in the most dangerous commodity of all, the written word. Alfonso X of Castile didn't just collect books, he turned them into crown jewels. Known as the Wise, this 13th century king transformed his court into a workshop of ideas, where scholars of every faith labored over manuscripts so exquisite they seemed touched by divine light. Take his Cantigas de Santa Maria, a towering collection of songs and miracles dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Each page a riot of color with miniatures depicting everything from royal hunts to medical miracles. But these weren't just beautiful objects, they were carefully crafted propaganda. Every gilded border whispered to visiting nobles and clergy, "Behold a ruler so enlightened, so favored by heaven, that even his books gleamed with celestial approval." Yet patronage on this scale was a dangerous game. When Alfonso commissioned translations of Arabic astronomy texts, he didn't just anger conservative bishops, he gave rivals a blueprint to his ambitions. Star charts could navigate ships for trade or war. Calendars predicting eclipses might awe superstitious armies into surrender. Small wonder then that his own son, Sancho IV, later ransacked the royal library during their bitter feud, knowing those manuscripts held the secrets of his father's power. Even Alfonso's lavish legal code, the Sayat Partidas, became a double-edged sword. While it unified his kingdom's laws, rebellious nobles pored over its passages to find loopholes against royal authority. The tension between display and defense birthed extraordinary innovations. Some monarchs ordered decoy manuscripts, less valuable copies left prominently on display while the real treasures hid in secret compartments beneath palace floors. Others employed cipher scripts, encoding military or alchemical knowledge in seemingly innocent religious texts. The French King Charles V went further, building a rotating bookcase in his Louvre library that could pivot to conceal sensitive volumes when unwelcome guests entered. What's often overlooked is how these patronage projects reshaped knowledge itself. When Alfonso's teams translated Arabic texts, they didn't just convert words, they blended cultures. A star catalogue might bear Latin names for constellations but use Arabic numerals for calculations, with Hebrew scribes adding marginal notes in their own tongue. These hybrid manuscripts became mirrors of their royal patrons, rulers who sought not just to possess knowledge, but to remix it into something uniquely theirs. And in that alchemy of ink and vellum, they laid the groundwork for something far greater, a Europe where books weren't just guarded treasures, but living things that could cross borders, bridge faiths, and rewrite the future. The flames that consumed heretical manuscripts in medieval town squares didn't just destroy parchment, they sought to rewrite reality itself. Imagine a bishop's trembling hand holding a torch to a stack of Cathar texts, each curling page erasing an alternative vision of Christianity. Or Frederick II's agents dumping Arabic philosophy into bonfires, the smoke carrying away ideas deemed too dangerous for European minds. These weren't just acts of censorship, they were psychological warfare, sending a visceral message to anyone who dared think differently. Knowledge could be lethal. The most infamous book burnings often masked political vendettas. When the Knights Templar were disbanded in the early 14th century, their meticulously kept financial records, evidence of Europe's first banking system, were among the first items fed to the flames. Not because they contained heresy, but because their detailed ledgers named kings and popes as debtors. Similarly, when the Hussite reforms began spreading through Bohemia, entire wagon-loads of vernacular Bibles were burned not for theological errors, but because they empowered commoners to interpret Scripture, undermining the Church's monopoly on divine truth. Yet destruction could never be total. Some monks became unlikely rebels, secretly copying condemned texts between the lines of approved works, a practice called palimpsesting. In Spain, Jewish scholars facing the Inquisition's fires smuggled out Kabbalistic writings by sewing them into the linings of Torah scrolls. Even the Vatican's own index of forbidden books backfired spectacularly. By listing titles, it inadvertently created a shopping list for underground collectors. A banned book became a status symbol among Renaissance nobles, its very illegality proof of its power. The paradox of these fiery purges, they often preserved what they sought to erase. When 9th century Byzantine Empress Theodora ordered the burning of iconoclastic texts, she unwittingly ensured their survival. Scribes made extra copies anticipating the crackdown. Charlemagne's destruction of Saxon pagan writings was so thorough that modern scholars can reconstruct them purely from the vehement condemnations in Christian chronicles. Like shadows cast by flames, the shape of lost knowledge often lingered in the very acts meant to obliterate it. What truly emerges from the ashes is a pattern far darker than mere censorship. These burnings reveal a world where ideas weren't just debated, they were hunted. A single surviving manuscript could spark rebellions, topple dynasties, or birth new religions. And in that relentless dance between destruction and preservation, we see the medieval world's rawest truth. Controlling thought wasn't about piety or even power, it was about survival. Because whoever decided which books burned and which survived held the quill that wrote history itself. A lavishly bound manuscript placed in a rival king's hands could speak louder than any herald's proclamation. Take the case of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, who sent a gorgeously illustrated copy of Dioscorides' medical texts to the Spanish Caliph Abd al-Rahman III. On the surface, it was a gesture of goodwill, but between the gold leaf pages lay a quiet boast. By gifting a Greek herbal so precise it could diagnose diseases unknown in the West, Constantine was subtly reminding the Caliph of Byzantium's unbroken link to ancient wisdom. The message, "Our knowledge runs deeper than your armies can march." These exchanges followed an intricate etiquette. When the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III received a mathematical treatise from the Abbasid Caliph, the accompanying letter praised his unquenchable thirst for learning. But court scholars quickly decoded the subtext. The text's advanced algebra problems were unsolvable with Europe's rudimentary numerals, a veiled jab at Christian intellectual inferiority. Otto's response, he commissioned an even more lavish copy of Boethius' Arithmetic bound in gem-studded covers, to silently assert that Rome's legacy still shone brighter than Baghdad's innovations. Some gifts carried darker implications. After the Mongol sack of Baghdad in the 13th century, survivors whispered that Hulagu Khan had sent the defeated caliph's prized astronomy books to European courts not as trophies but as warnings. The unspoken threat coiled within those star charts. If a civilization as advanced as Islam's could fall, so too could yours. Even wedding dowries became vehicles for this silent warfare. When the French Princess Anne of Kiev married King Henry I of France, her trousseau included Slavic law books, a quiet suggestion that her homeland's legal sophistication might benefit her new husband's backward kingdom. The most cunning rulers turned these exchanges into intelligence operations. Venetian diplomats routinely gifted beautifully copied histories to Ottoman sultans, carefully editing passages to exaggerate Venetian victories and downplay defeats. The French King Louis IX, while crusading in Egypt, accidentally left behind a medical text with marginal notes detailing European castle defenses, knowing it would be copied and circulated, planting misinformation in enemy hands. Yet for all their strategic weight, these book exchanges also wove unexpected bridges. A Persian poetry collection gifted to a Sicilian king sparked a fashion for Arabic verse across Italian courts. A Norse saga sent to an English queen preserved myths that might have otherwise vanished. In the delicate dance of medieval diplomacy, books were the rare language both conquerors and conquered could understand, a currency of ideas that often outlasted the kingdoms that traded them. While kings and monks dominate most medieval book histories, a quieter revolution unfolded in the chambers of queens and noblewomen. Take Elena of Aquitaine, twice a queen, mother of kings, and one of the most voracious book collectors of her age. Her personal library wasn't just decoration, it was a diplomatic weapon. When she commissioned lavish copies of Arthurian romances, she wasn't merely indulging in fantasy. She was crafting a narrative that linked her Plantagenet dynasty to legendary rulers of old. And when she sent her daughter Marie to Champagne with a trunk of troubadour poetry, she seeded French courtly love traditions that would shape European literature for centuries. Then there's Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess whose illuminated manuscripts blurred the lines between science and mysticism. Her civias, a dazzling fusion of theology and medicine, became so sought after that emperors and popes waited years for copies. But Hildegard's genius lay in how she wielded her books, gifting them strategically to secure protection for her convent, using their startling illustrations of divine visions to silence critics who questioned a woman's right to teach. Her works traveled further than she ever could, carrying her influence from German forests to the Vatican's inner circles. These women exploited a loophole in medieval society's rules. While female literacy was often discouraged, pious book ownership was praised, a contradiction clever minds turned to their advantage. The French Queen Blanche of Castile commissioned moral instruction books for her son Louis IX, embedding her political wisdom in tales of saintly kings. In Spain, Queen Berenguela funded translations of Arabic medical texts specifically addressing women's health, creating a discreet network of knowledge among noble households. Even in convents where rules forbade personal property, abbesses like Herad of Landsberg compiled encyclopedic manuscripts like the Garden of Delights, a 12th century Wikipedia blending scripture, philosophy, and bawdy fables that monks would have banned had they known its content. The scale of their impact becomes clear when tracing lost libraries. After the Albigensian Crusade ravaged southern France, it was Countess Esclarmonde de Foix who smuggled Cathar texts to safety in Aragon, preserving heterodox ideas that would resurface during the Reformation. In England, Margaret Beaufort's patronage of printers didn't just produce beautiful books, it quietly promoted the Tudor claim to the throne through carefully selected genealogies. These women understood what many warlords did not, that a well-placed manuscript could outmaneuver an army and that the pen, when held in the right hand, could rewrite the rules of the game entirely. The rise of universities didn't just create centers of learning, it ignited a new front in the medieval knowledge wars. Picture the scene in 12th century Paris, where royal agents and papal legates prowled the fledgling Latin Quarter, each trying to sway the curriculum in their favor. A king might endow a chair in civil law to train loyal bureaucrats, while the church funded theology lectures to ensure doctrinal purity. But beneath these noble intentions lay a raw truth. Universities were factories for manufacturing influence, and whoever controlled the textbooks controlled the minds of Europe's future leaders. Oxford's early days reveal how high the stakes were. When Henry II banned English students from attending Parisian schools during a political dispute with France, he inadvertently fueled Oxford's growth, not out of love for learning, but to keep his brightest subjects from absorbing French loyalties. The books they studied became tools of soft power. A copy of Justinian's legal codes annotated to emphasize royal authority over papal claims. That wasn't just education, it was indoctrination. Even the physical layout of libraries reflected this struggle. At Bologna, the world's oldest university, law books were chained to desks in a specific order. Imperial edicts first, local statutes last, visually reinforcing where ultimate authority should reside. The Vatican played an equally cunning game. By granting exclusive rights to certify theology degrees, the Church effectively held a veto over what could be taught. A professor daring to lecture on Aristotle's forbidden works risked excommunication, while those towing the line received cushy bishoprics, but monarchs fought back with patronage. Frederick II founded the University of Naples specifically to bypass church-controlled education, stocking its shelves with Arabic scientific texts that traditional universities banned. In Spain, Alfonso VIII of Castile established study houses for translating Jewish and Muslim texts into Latin, knowing these heretical sciences could give his kingdom an economic edge. What made universities such explosive battlegrounds was their democratization of knowledge. Unlike monastery libraries accessible only to clerics or royal collections locked in palaces, university books circulated among hungry-minded commoners. A merchant's son studying medicine in Montpellier might memorize Arabic surgical techniques, then take them back to his hometown, eroding the monopoly of church-trained physicians. The very structure of lectures where texts were read aloud and debated created a viral spread of ideas no censor could fully contain. Yet the most fascinating twist came from the scholars themselves. These weren't passive receptacles for royal or papal agendas, but cunning players in their own right. When Oxford masters defied King Henry III by teaching from smuggled Parisian texts, they weren't just being rebellious, they were asserting intellectual independence. At Bologna, law students formed guilds to hire and fire professors, creating Europe's first tenure system. Even the humble practice of taking lecture notes birthed a shadow market, as students sold unauthorized copies of commentaries that often contradicted official doctrines. By the 14th century, the university arms race had reshaped Europe's power map. The French crown poured money into Paris to outshine English Oxford, while Prague's new university became a rallying point for Czech nationalism against German influence. Every lecture hall, every disputed text, every graduation ceremony was now part of the great medieval game, one where the ultimate prize wasn't land or gold, but the allegiance of the minds that would someday inherit the world. And as the Renaissance dawned, these battlegrounds of parchment and ink would prove more decisive than any battlefield. The clattering of metal type in Mainz around the year 1440 might have sounded like mere workshop noise, but it was actually the death knell for medieval Europe's book wars. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press didn't just produce books faster, it shattered the centuries-old system where knowledge was hoarded like gold in royal vaults and monastery scriptoriums. Suddenly, a single printer could churn out hundreds of identical volumes in the time it took a scribe to complete one page. The implications were terrifying to those in power. What good was a king's prized Aristotle manuscript when cheap printed copies flooded market stalls from Paris to Prague? Kings and popes reacted with a mix of panic and opportunism. In England, Henry VII saw the press's propaganda potential, commissioning printed genealogies that proved his shaky claim to the throne. Meanwhile, the Vatican scrambled to control the new technology, granting exclusive printing rights for Bibles to loyal monasteries, only to watch as pirate editions smuggled from Basel undercut their prices. The most desperate attempts at suppression came from Constantinople, where the last Byzantine emperors banned printed Greek texts, fearing they'd undermine the value of their ancient manuscript collections. It was a losing battle. When the Ottomans finally sacked the city in 1453, they found its libraries stuffed with handwritten treasures that were already becoming obsolete. But the real revolution happened in the shadows. Printers became power brokers, their shops acting as clandestine meeting places for radical ideas. A Venetian workshop might produce a beautifully illuminated psalter for a duke one week, then secretly run off pamphlets mocking the same duke's taxes the next. In Mainz, Gutenberg's own financier, Johann Fust, was accused of sorcery when townsfolk saw identical pages emerging from the press. How else could words duplicate themselves except by black magic? The Church's nightmare came true when Luther's 95 Theses spread across Germany in weeks instead of years, proving that heresy could now outpace the speed of censors. What made the printing press truly unstoppable was its economic alchemy. A handwritten Bible once cost as much as a farm, a printed one sold for a few weeks' wages. Universities that once guarded their manuscript collections like dragons' hoards now required students to buy printed textbooks. Even warfare transformed printed military manuals, standardized siege techniques across Europe, while propaganda broadsides turned peasants into patriots. The medieval book wars had been fought over scarcity. Gutenberg made knowledge abundant, yet for all its disruptive power, the press didn't erase the old world overnight. Wealthy collectors still prized handwritten manuscripts as status symbols, much like vinyl records in the digital age. Monastic scribes found new work as proofreaders for sloppy printers. And monarchs adapted, shifting from controlling books to controlling printers, licensing some, imprisoning others. But the genie was out of the inkhorn. When Frederick III displayed Europe's first printed book in his Vienna treasury, he unknowingly curated a relic of a fading age. The true treasures now sat in common homes, shops, and taverns, where anyone with a few coins could purchase what kings once went to war for: the power to hold ideas in their hands. The flames that swallowed Constantinople's imperial library in 1204 didn't just burn parchment, they erased centuries of voices in a single night. Among the ash piles were treatises on geometry copied from Alexandria's own ruins, medical texts tracing back to Hippocrates, and perhaps the last complete copy of Livy's History of Rome. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across the medieval world, libraries that had survived barbarian invasions and political upheavals met crueler fates. Damp rot in neglected monastery cellars, the deliberate slicing of illuminated manuscripts for their gold leaf, or entire collections sold off page by page to pay a king's ransom. Consider the fate of Cordoba's legendary library, once the brightest beacon of Islamic Spain. At its height in the 10th century, it held over 400,000 volumes, a number unimaginable in Christian Europe at the time. But during the Berber sack of 1011, its shelves were emptied not by torchfire but by bureaucracy. Conservative clerics, viewing Greek philosophy as dangerous innovation, ordered the systematic dismantling of the collection. Manuscripts were hidden, sold, or simply left to crumble in damp storerooms. By the time Christian knights entered the city in 1236, they found only echoes, a handful of Arabic medical texts repurposed as stuffing for saddlebags. Equally tragic was the slow death of the Carolingian Renaissance's greatest libraries. Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, had amassed a breathtaking collection in Campigny astronomical charts with moving parts, gospel books painted with lapis lazuli worth their weight in gold. Yet within 2 generations, Viking raids forced monks to prioritize saving relics over books. A chronicler from the monastery of St. Riquier recounts the heart-wrenching choice, hauling heavy chests of saintly bones to safety while leaving behind annotated copies of Virgil and Ovid, their pages later found fluttering in river mud downstream. Some losses cut deeper because they were self-inflicted. When the great Mongol warlord Hulagu Khan conquered Baghdad in 1258, his soldiers reportedly threw so many books from the House of Wisdom into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink for days. But less known is how Baghdad's own scholars, fearing Christian crusaders would loot their scientific works, had already dismantled much of the collection, scattering volumes to distant cities where many were eventually lost anyway. A similar irony befell the Visigothic Royal Library in Toledo, hidden away during the Muslim conquest only to be accidentally burned by Christian monks 8 centuries later while clearing pagan clutter from their new cathedral. Yet from these ruins glimmer strange tales of survival. A single surviving leaf from the library of the Umayyad caliphs, found lining a Syrian merchant's trunk, preserved the only known fragment of a lost Greek geography text. A waterlogged chest fished from a Venetian canal yielded moldy pages that, when carefully dried, revealed long-forgotten Byzantine naval tactics. Even the infamous destruction of the Maya codices by Spanish friars couldn't erase all traces. Modern scholars have reconstructed fragments of their astronomy from marginal notes in surviving Catholic catechisms. What these fragments whisper across time isn't just a lament for what was lost, but a warning about how knowledge dies, not always in dramatic bonfires, but often through slow neglect, bureaucratic indifference, or the misguided belief that some ideas are too dangerous to preserve. The medieval world's greatest libraries didn't just house books, they were ecosystems of thought, where a marginal note scribbled in one century could spark a revolution in another. Their disappearance reminds us that every age believes itself the guardian of wisdom until history proves it merely the caretaker, and not always a diligent one. In the shadowy corners of medieval libraries, some manuscripts whispered secrets only a chosen few could hear, not because the words were rare, but because they weren't really there at all. Hidden beneath pious psalms or dry legal texts, cryptographers etched messages in lemon juice that would darken when heated, or carved tiny pinpricks above letters to spell out clandestine orders. A monk copying scripture might unknowingly transmit battle plans by altering the flourishes on his capitals, while a cookbook's recipe for spiced wine could conceal the ingredients for Greek fire. This wasn't just reading, it was high-stakes espionage where every page might be a puzzle box waiting to be cracked. Take the infamous case of Roger Bacon, the 13th century scholar who embedded revolutionary scientific ideas in his works using a complex alphabet cipher. When the church demanded his texts for review, they saw only harmless philosophical musings, but fellow Franciscans who knew the key uncovered diagrams for telescopes and flying machines hidden in plain sight. Even more brazen was the Habsburg Emperor Frederick III, who commissioned an entire fake genealogy with coded annotations detailing which noble families could be blackmailed for treason. The manuscript still sits in Vienna's archives, its innocuous family tree concealing political dynamite behind what scholars long assumed were mere scribble errors. The techniques varied as wildly as their inventors. Some scribes used null ciphers, where every third word in a prayer formed a secret sentence. Others employed the dancing men method, tiny figures drawn in margins whose arm positions corresponded to letters. The most sophisticated hid messages in music. A hymn's notes could map to grid coordinates in a military manual. When the Duke of Burgundy intercepted a seemingly innocent songbook from the French court, his cryptographers spent months before realizing the melody's rhythm matched the marching cadence of troops gathering near his border. Decoding these texts required equal parts brilliance and paranoia. Alfonso the Wise of Castile kept a team of Jewish mathematicians on retainer solely to decrypt intercepted Arabic manuscripts, knowing they often contained veiled insults or false intelligence. The Vatican's secret archives still hold clean copies of controversial texts, doctored versions with heretical passages removed while the originals were locked away with ciphers indicating which cardinals had access. Even personal letters between monarchs weren't safe. When Edward III of England wrote to his son using a cipher based on chess moves, French spies painstakingly recreated their chessboard to crack the code. What makes these encrypted texts so fascinating isn't just their cleverness, but their desperation. Behind every cipher lay someone with something dangerous to say: a scientist evading heresy charges, a queen plotting against her husband, a spy reporting troop movements. In an age where owning the wrong book could mean death, encryption turned parchment into a battleground where ideas fought for survival. And sometimes they won. When scholars finally decoded the Voynich manuscript centuries later, they found not treason or heresy, but something perhaps more revolutionary: a 15th century woman's treatise on gynecology, her knowledge so threatening to male physicians she'd wrapped it in an unreadable alphabet. The greatest secret wasn't always the message, but who got to control the key. The echoes of medieval book wars reverberate through every library, classroom, and digital archive in our modern world. Those ancient struggles over parchment and ink didn't just decide which kings kept their thrones, they laid the groundwork for how we think about education, power, and who gets to control the flow of information. Consider the modern university lecture hall. Its very structure, professors debating texts, students scribbling notes, stems directly from those medieval scriptorium battles where monks argued over Aristotelian logic while princes eavesdropped for useful insight. Even today's intellectual property laws trace back to medieval guilds guarding their manuscript copying techniques as trade secrets, but the parallels run deeper than mere structure. When governments today debate internet censorship or textbook revisions, they're replaying the same dilemmas medieval rulers faced, just with different tools. A king burning Cathar manuscripts in 13th century France and a modern regime blocking social media share the same fear: uncontrolled ideas change societies. Even the tech giants' algorithm wars mirror medieval conflicts, with platforms like Google and Meta acting as the new monastic gatekeepers, deciding which knowledge gets amplified and which gets buried. The players have changed, but the game remains startlingly familiar. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in how we value knowledge itself. The medieval belief that books were worth ransoming cities or marrying princesses evolved into today's multi-billion-dollar publishing and education industries. The Vatican's secret archives have their modern counterpart in paywalled academic journals and proprietary databases. And just as Frederick II hoarded Arabic medical texts for military advantage, corporations now patent genetic research, turning life-saving knowledge into guarded treasure. Yet history offers warnings too. The tragic losses from Baghdad's House of Wisdom to the Maya codices remind us that knowledge is fragile. When the Library of Alexandria burned, it took centuries for Europe to reconstruct its lost geometry from Arabic translations. Today, as digital archives face hacking, decay, and corporate instability, we risk losing entire generations of work in the blink of an electronic failure. The medieval solution, redundancy, copying manuscripts across continents and cultures. It's a lesson modern archivists are relearning as they etch Wikipedia onto nickel plates and store them in Arctic vaults. What ultimately survived the medieval knowledge wars wasn't just individual texts, but the radical idea that information should circulate. The printing press won not because it was invented, but because enough people decided books belonged in taverns as much as palaces. That same tension drives today's open access movements and whistleblower platforms, because whether scribed on vellum or encoded in silicon, knowledge remains humanity's most potent weapon and its most vulnerable treasure. The battles may have changed venues, but the stakes are timeless. Who controls the story controls the future. Centuries after kings ransacked monasteries for manuscripts, we're fighting the same battles, only now the treasures aren't locked in vaulted libraries but in glowing server farms. The medieval struggle to control knowledge never truly ended. It just swapped parchment for pixels. Think about it. When a tech giant like Google digitizes millions of books, it's not so different from Charlemagne hoarding texts in Aachen. Both acts are framed as preservation, yet both concentrate power over who gets to read what and when. Even the tactics feel familiar. Medieval monks encrypted messages in manuscript margins. Today, whistleblowers use encrypted apps to leak data. Kings burned heretical texts. Modern regimes block websites or flood social media with disinformation. The weapons have changed, but the war remains. Consider the parallels between medieval scriptoria and today's content moderation teams. In the 14th century, the Vatican employed censors to scrub manuscripts of dangerous ideas before copying. Now, algorithms and human reviewers silently remove or demote content deemed unacceptable, whether for legitimate reasons or political convenience. The Byzantine emperor who ordered the destruction of iconoclastic texts would have understood YouTube's takedown policies perfectly. And just as medieval rulers funded lavish libraries to burnish their reputations, today's billionaires pour money into digital archives, their philanthropy doubling as reputation laundering. The Bezos Earth Library or the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative's book scans, they're the modern equivalent of Alfonso the Wise's Cantiga's spectacles of generosity, masking deeper ambitions. Yet the most striking echo lies in the black markets. Medieval scribes sold forbidden texts under butcher shop counters. Today, shadow libraries like Sci-Hub pirate academic papers behind onion domains. The motive is identical: bypass gatekeepers who monetize access to knowledge. When a student in Tehran downloads a smuggled PDF of a Cambridge University Press monograph, she's reenacting the same desperation that drove a 15th century scholar to bribe a monk for a glimpse of Aristotle. Even the backlash mirrors history. Publishers today sue pirate sites with the same fury the church reserved for heretical copyists, while paywalled journals play the role of medieval monasteries, charging exorbitant fees for scrolls their scribes didn't even write. The stakes, though, are exponentially higher. A lost medieval manuscript might erase one scholar's work, but a corrupted cloud backup or a hacked government database can obliterate entire cultures. When Russia targets Ukrainian digital archives or ISIS demolishes physical libraries, they're waging the same war Hulagu Khan did in Baghdad, erasing the enemy's memory to control their future. And just as medieval translations sparked the Renaissance, today's open-source movements and Wikipedia edits democratize knowledge in ways that terrify autocrats. The difference: speed. Gutenberg's press took decades to disrupt Europe. A viral tweet reshapes politics in minutes. What the medieval book wars teach us is this: knowledge never stays monopolized for long. The scribes who smuggled texts under their robes, the printers who defied papal bans, the students who memorized forbidden verses, they all found cracks in the system. Today's firewalls and paywalls will crumble too, because humanity's thirst for ideas is as relentless now as it was when a Frankish king traded prisoners for a Plato manuscript. The battlegrounds have shifted from castle scriptoriums to corporate boardrooms, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged: whoever controls the story controls the world. And this time, the whole planet is reading. The race to save medieval manuscripts today isn't just about preservation, it's a high-tech resurrection of those ancient battles for knowledge. Picture the British Library's imaging lab, where multispectral cameras peel back centuries of damage, revealing erased annotations in Charlemagne's legal texts that could rewrite our understanding of early medieval law. Or the Vatican's secretive codicology unit, where chemists analyze thousand-year-old inks to trace looted manuscripts back to their original monasteries. These aren't merely conservation projects, they're forensic investigations into history's greatest unsolved book heists. Modern technology has turned every recovered manuscript into a time capsule with multiple layers of secrets. When researchers at the University of Cambridge recently digitized a seemingly ordinary psalter, ultraviolet light exposed something astonishing. Beneath the Latin prayers lay a palimpsest of an Irish king's land grants, scraped away by Norman conquerors. Similarly, spectral imaging on a fire-damaged Aristotle text in Naples revealed margin notes by Frederick II's court scholars, debating whether the philosopher's ideas could justify defying the Pope. Each scan becomes a digital excavation, uncovering the hidden battles waged in ink across generations. The challenges mirror those faced by medieval librarians, just with silicon instead of vellum. Climate-controlled vaults now replace monastery cellars, but the threats remain eerily familiar. When war ravaged Timbuktu in 2012, librarians smuggled out thousands of medieval Islamic manuscripts in donkey carts and fishing boats, echoing how Byzantine scholars once hid texts from crusaders. In Oxford, flood barriers protect the Bodleian's collections from rising Thames waters, just as monks elevated their bookshelves after the Great Rhine floods of 1342. Even digital storage faces its own. Viking cyberattacks on university archives have increased fivefold since 2018, with hackers demanding ransoms for encrypted medieval texts. What's changed is the scale of collaboration. The Europeana Regia project reunites fragments of Charles V's scattered library across 9 countries through virtual reconstruction, while the Sinai Palimpsests project uses machine learning to decipher erased Syriac texts beneath later Greek writing. Crowdsourcing platforms like Transcribus enlist thousands of volunteers to transcribe difficult scripts, creating searchable databases that would make Alfonso X's translation teams weep with envy. The dream of those medieval rulers, universal access to knowledge, is being achieved not through conquest but through cooperation, yet the old tensions persist. When the Louvre digitized its medieval collection, critics noted how few Arabic manuscripts appeared compared to French ones, a silent continuation of centuries-old biases. Auction houses still sell illuminated pages torn from manuscripts, despite outcries from scholars, and the British Museum's refusal to return the Ethiopic Garima Gospels, looted during colonial times, mirrors the very plundering practices this video has documented. The tools may be scanners instead of scribes, but the fundamental question remains: who gets to control humanity's shared intellectual heritage? Perhaps the most poetic justice lies in how modern science is redeeming history's losses. At Stanford, researchers are developing AI that can reconstruct texts from fragments no human could piece together, like the charred remains of manuscripts burned during the English Reformation. In Dresden, a synagogue's geniza storage for damaged sacred texts yielded medical prescriptions from Maimonides' school, preserved because Jewish tradition forbade destroying any writing containing God's name. Even the blackened pages of manuscripts carbonized by Vesuvius are now being read through particle accelerator imaging. These efforts form a bridge across time, connecting today's scholars with those medieval monks who stayed up copying texts by candlelight, knowing their work might be all that stood between civilization and oblivion. The war over books hasn't ended, it's just entered a new chapter where the weapons are lasers instead of quills, and the battlefield spans server farms as well as ancient libraries. But the goal remains unchanged: to ensure that no voice from our past is ever permanently silenced again. Beneath the dust of unopened archives and behind the false spines of mislabeled collections, the ghosts of lost medieval books still whisper. Take the legendary library of Ivan the Terrible, rumored to contain hundreds of Byzantine manuscripts looted from Constantinople, hidden somewhere beneath the Kremlin's labyrinthine passages. For centuries, Tsars and Soviet archaeologists alike have searched in vain, tantalized by cryptic inventory lists mentioning Greek fire manuals and imperial purple codices. Then there's the enduring mystery of the Malastiana Library's vanished treatise on alchemy, stolen during a 15th century siege and allegedly smuggled inside a hollowed-out crucifix. Its last known owner, a Medici prince who reportedly used its formulas to fake his own death. Even more haunting are the gaps we can't quantify, the books that vanished without witnesses. When Viking raiders torched the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, how many unique Irish chronicles turned to ash? Scholars estimate that for every surviving Anglo-Saxon manuscript, 50 more were lost. The same grim arithmetic applies to Baghdad's House of Wisdom, where the Mongol siege didn't just destroy books, it erased entire schools of thought. We know of Persian medical texts referenced in surviving Arabic works, but the originals have evaporated like morning mist. Modern technology offers flickers of hope. Multispectral imaging recently revealed erased annotations in a Spanish monastic ledger that may locate missing Visigothic law books. In Switzerland, a researcher scanning cathedral walls with ground-penetrating radar detected hollow spaces that could be the sealed heresy vaults where bishops hid condemned texts. But the most tantalizing leads come from unexpected places, like a Parisian bookbinder's discovery in 2018. While restoring an 18th century Bible, he found scraps of vellum reinforcing the spine, fragments of a 9th century French epic, previously unknown to scholars, salvaged from some long-dead librarian's scrap pile. The greatest enigma isn't just what was lost, but why some texts survived against all odds. How did a single copy of Beowulf endure when countless other pagan epics perished? Why did Charlemagne's personal gospel book surface in a Croatian fisherman's trunk centuries after vanishing in a shipwreck? Every recovered manuscript is a defiance of time's randomness, like the Archimedes palimpsest, where a 13th century prayer book concealed the genius's erased geometry, waiting 700 years for ultraviolet light to resurrect his calculations. Perhaps the most poignant mysteries revolve around the books we know existed but can't reconstruct. The Emerald Tablet of Alchemy, last seen in Frederick II's traveling library, described in letters as bound in serpent skin with silver hinges. The missing volume of Marco Polo's travels that supposedly detailed his years as a Mongol tax collector. Even personal libraries leave spectral traces, like the inventory from Elena of Aquitaine's final days, listing a Saracen mirror book that taught celestial navigation, now vanished without a single surviving page. What keeps historians awake isn't just the loss, but the possibility, however faint, of rediscovery. A crumbling manor attic in Normandy might hold the missing Cathar Gospels. Some overlooked Vatican crate could contain the original illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy, discarded by a frugal printer, because in the end, medieval manuscripts are more than ink and parchment. They're frozen conversations across centuries, waiting for someone to lean close and listen. And as long as a single undiscovered book might still lie hidden, the story isn't over, it's just paused between chapters. Now that we've journeyed through the rise and fall of medieval libraries, from Charlemagne's scriptoriums to the ashes of Baghdad, it's time to turn the quill over to you. Picture yourself standing at the crossroads of history, with the power to rescue one of these treasure troves from oblivion. Would you dash into the flames of Constantinople to salvage the last copy of Livy's lost histories? Or would you barter with Viking raiders to save the illuminated Gospels of Lindisfarne, their pages glowing like captured sunlight? Maybe you'd smuggle a chest of Arabic astronomical texts from Cordoba's crumbling library, ensuring Ptolemy's star charts could guide future navigators. This isn't just a hypothetical game, it's a chance to reckon with what we value most. Would you prioritize the lyrical beauty of a Persian poetry collection, the life-saving formulas in a Moorish medical manual, or the heretical Cathar texts that challenged an empire's dogma? Every choice reveals something about how knowledge shapes us. After all, the books we save are the ones that whisper to future generations. So tell me in the comments, which library would you rescue and why? Maybe you'll champion a lesser-known collection, like the Visigothic law codes of Toledo or the Slavic chronicles of Kiev. Or perhaps you'll make the case for a single, irreplaceable volume, like the original sketches for Leonardo's flying machine, inspired by rediscovered Arabic engineering texts. Whatever you choose, you're joining a tradition as old as parchment itself, the endless human quest to preserve ideas against the tide of time. And who knows? Your pick might just inspire someone else to dive deeper into the stories behind these ancient shelves. Let's keep the legacy of these knowledge warriors alive, one comment at a time.